Edgar Allan Poe. The architect of apprehension, engineer of the eerie, designer of dread, the master of the melancholy and the macabre. But perhaps the most intriguing detail about Poe is not found in the literature of his life, but in the enigma of his death. For the father of the detective story died befitting of his own writings, shrouded in a mystery and darkness that has endured to this very day. On September 27, 1849, Poe steps off of a ferry. On October 3rd of that same year, he is found delirious, nonsensical, in borrowed clothes. 4 days later, he dies. What happened during those 5 days that Poe was unaccounted for? Did something in that time frame ultimately lead to his death? Join us as we step back in time to explore dimly lit saloons, roam cobblestone streets, and investigate dark alleyways to find the last stop of Edgar Allan Poe.
Throughout history, countless events have occurred outside the realm of explanation. From a guitarist selling his soul to the devil, ships lost at sea, an entire civilization vanishing. Stories that range from the unnerving to the downright bizarre. This tale begins with a humble writer and unfolds the mystery that made Baltimore his last stop.
October 3rd, 1849. A gray and dreary morning. A man lies on the street outside of a tavern, crumpled, barely conscious. A passerby reaches his hand over to aid the figure. Astonishment sets in as the identity of the figure is revealed. Edgar Allan Poe. Alarmed, the passerby tries to help Poe regain his bearings, but to no avail. Fading in and out of consciousness, Poe is able to give a single name: J. Snodgrass. A frantic letter is quickly penned and sent to his home.
Dear Sir, there is a gentleman rather the worse for wear at Ryan's 4th Ward polls who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Joseph W. Walker.
Poe was then taken to the Washington College Hospital, and early in the afternoon of October 7th, Poe uttered what is thought to be his last words.
Lord, help my poor soul.
At the age of 40, America's most infamous storyteller would pass on to the annals of history, leaving behind a literary legacy that would be admired for generations.
And yet, the myths surrounding his death have become inexplicably intertwined with how the man supposedly lived his life. Curious tales, conspiracies, plots of intrigue, and speculations that grow more fantastical with every rendition. And at the core of it all, the only known fact: Edgar had arrived in Baltimore on September 27th. His whereabouts between that day and October 3rd may hold the key to unlocking the mystery of how the father of the detective story met his end. His obituary, ironically penned by the author's arch nemesis, paints a disturbing picture, one that is universally considered today's image of Poe. A shambling drunk reprobate who spurned his narrative detractors, addicted to opium and wandering the shadowed corners of depression and despair.
He was at all times a dreamer, dwelling in ideal realms in heaven or hell, peopled with creatures and the accidents of his brain. He walked the streets in madness or melancholy, with lips moving in indistinct curses, or with eyes upturned in passionate prayers, with his glances introverted to a heart gnawed with anguish, and with his eyes shrouded in gloom. We have not learned of the circumstance of his death. Rufus Griswold, The New York Tribune, October 9th, 1849.
And yet, new evidence seems to paint a much different picture. Though the Massachusetts capital of Boston claims his birthplace, the original master of the macabre would come to call Baltimore home.
It's interesting because a lot of cities love to claim Poe. from Richmond to Boston to New York, and they all have a part in the Poe story, obviously. This was his ancestral home. David Poe was a Revolutionary War hero, and that was his grandfather. After he got out of West Point, he moved to Baltimore. At that point, if you would have asked him what he did, he would probably have described himself as a poet, because he had never written a word of prose up to that point.
In 1833, Poe moved with his aunt, Maria Clem, from the eastern part of Baltimore City to this house here. Now, this home on Amity Street would see the emergence of not only Poe the poet, but Poe the author.
It was in this house where Poe entered a local writing contest for short stories and poetry and won a very special prize that got him started professionally. As a young man, Poe was staying with members of his family here in Baltimore, and he's the first American writer to support himself entirely by his pen. And Baltimore can very proudly claim that this was the city where he first was recognized for his talent.
By the end of 1835, Poe would routinely change residences to keep up with the demand of his work. He also famously fell in love with his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia Clem, whom he would go on to marry.
This is where we see this incredibly tender side of Edgar Allan Poe. And the love that he had for Muddy and for Virginia, I think is really extraordinary.
While working for the Daily Standard in Philadelphia, Poe had his first interaction with the man who would become his self-anointed literary executor, Rufus Griswold.
A literary executor was a literary execution. Griswold was perhaps his worst misjudgment of character, because he actually believed Griswold was a friend. He believed Griswold admired him, and I do think Griswold admired his writing ability. It's really sad when you look at the impact that Griswold had, because he really did shape how we thought about Poe. And it wasn't until the 20th century that some contrary opinions started to arise, that maybe Poe wasn't the debased, maniacal drunkard that Griswold painted him to be.
It's surmised that he played on Maria's sympathies and pretended to be more of a friend to Poe than he truly was, but he became Poe's literary executor, and he wrote a spurious biography that claimed many things that eventually had to be raked out of the history. Many of Poe's friends and loved ones defended Poe afterwards, but the damage had been done. Rufus Griswold's intent may have been to malign Poe's reputation, but what it did serve instead was to make Poe notorious and immortal.
The year of 1847 would see the world of Edgar Allan Poe finally crack. On January 30th, after suffering from tuberculosis, Poe's beloved wife died.
Virginia's death completely devastated him.
The swift flicker of his young wife's short life would seem to haunt Edgar for eternity.
The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins?
Summoning the strength to somehow carry on without his beloved Virginia, Poe decided to establish his own literary magazine called The Stylus. For nearly 2 years, Poe would seek out investors and court prospective contributors in his quest to bring his scholarly dreams to life. Finally, luck would strike twofold in 1849, when he returned to Richmond, as by this time he had acquired not only enough money to start funding The Stylus, but he had also become engaged to childhood sweetheart Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton.
He wanted to put his best foot forward, and he was a widower and wanted to start a new life with her and to recover a lost young love.
With a newfound purpose, a newfound love, and the summit of his literary aspirations in sight, Poe penned an excited letter to his mother-in-law Maria Clem about his upcoming plans on September 18, 1849.
I lectured at Norfolk on Monday. I had a highly fashionable audience, but Norfolk is a small place, and there were 2 exhibitions the same night. On Thursday, I may start for New York. If I do, I will go straight over to Mrs. Lewis's and send for you. Your own, Eddie.
He was supposed to take a train to Philadelphia and then up to New York, and somehow he was waylaid, and it is still a mystery as to why.
Poe was planning to depart on September 27th via one of the many paddle-wheel steamships that bustled between Richmond and Baltimore. Once there, he would board a train to Philadelphia to tend to some editing work. He'd then continue on to New York City to collect Maria. Finally, Poe and Maria would return to Richmond for his wedding with Sarah Shelton. On the night of September 26th, Poe would come to the home of his fiancée to bid her goodbye before he departed on his journey north. She recalled,
"He came up to my house on the evening of 26th of September to take leave of me. He was very sad and complained of being quite sick. I felt so wretched about him all of that night."
At the behest of Sarah, Poe visited the office of Dr. John F. Carter, who later revealed the author's last whereabouts before leaving Richmond.
From this man of departure, I inferred he expected to return shortly, but did not see him again, and was surprised to learn next day that he had left for Baltimore by the early morning boat.
The ferry from Richmond would take several hours and would land at what is today Baltimore's Inner Harbor. There have been varying opinions spanning many generations about the events that transpired after his arrival. We will now draw back the curtain on three of the most widely accepted theories, for the mysterious end of Edgar Allan Poe begins here, as he would never make it to Philadelphia or New York.
One of the most common theories about the mysterious end of Poe is that his fate was sealed not by some unseen vengeful forces, but by the poor chance of malady.
Poe, I think, had years and years of a lifestyle that just didn't contribute to good health. I think he was often malnourished because he was in that dire a situation in terms of his poverty. Just having coal to keep the stove going, to keep the place warm, was often a struggle. So I think years of living in substandard conditions really just wore him down, so that if there was a disease, he would be pretty susceptible.
Throughout his life, Poe claimed illnesses, and it was unclear whether or not his illnesses were lingering illnesses as an effect of alcohol, or if there's some sort of chemical imbalance.
My understanding of Poe and alcohol, Poe got fairly inebriated from like one drink. And so he wasn't somebody who was closing out the pub and drinking bottle after bottle. He would have one drink and then he would be inebriated. So I don't think that he drank to the degree that would give someone, say, cirrhosis of the liver. I just don't think that he imbibed enough.
Various Poe historians who subscribe to this theory believe that Poe's end came by rabies, alcohol poisoning, or more recently, a brain tumor.
The death certificate said either something like brain fever or brain congestion. I mean, they had these catch-all phrases. They didn't really know this had something to do with the brain. So there are some people that suspect it could be something like encephalitis. It could be.
Tests performed on locks of Poe's hair in 1999 have ruled out the possibility of any potential toxic interventions, which may have explained the poet's sickly state. The case of Poe's death by rabies was made popular in 1996, when a doctor participating in a pathological conference diagnosed his symptoms of being characteristic of the condition.
26 years after his death, Poe's body was exhumed for more ceremonious reburial. During this time, the presumption of a brain tumor also surfaced. This theory was dismissed due to the sheer inability to confirm this.
I mean, healthcare in that era was pretty shabby, as we know, or certainly by today's standards, if one has access to healthcare.
I'm not certain that I'm entirely convinced by any of the theories, other than the fact that it was the middle 1800s. Poe was 40 years old. He was traveling, and he had been ill for whatever reasons. So it's entirely possible that his circumstances were exacerbated, especially under the conditions that he was traveling.
A final supposition which encompasses most of the truth behind the affliction theory is that Poe had a bad case of the flu. His symptoms before leaving Richmond, as well as the fact that it was raining on the day Poe arrived, seem to lend credit to the notion that Poe had succumbed to one of the nation's oldest killers.
A more fitting pretext for Poe is that he found his end through the evil intentions of someone else. While he may have been one of America's most celebrated poets and authors of prose, many people despised his personal character.
Poe's reputation at that time was less than stellar. He had made many enemies. He did have some very loyal friends, but he'd had a difficult life.
Thought to be a depressive drunk due to his ability to conjure up such lurid descriptions and lunatic ideas, Poe was often regarded with low social significance. While his work would bring him periodic bouts of financial success, Poe would spend a majority of his life at the mercy of debtors and the charity of his fiscally sound friends.
He had no real source of income that was reliable. I mean, he might write something and be able to sell it for, now that he's more famous, $10. But you know, how long is that going to last, even in the early 19th century? Poe was simultaneously famous and a pauper.
When engaged to his fiancée, it is thought that Sarah's family took exception to the match, namely her brothers.
It is quite possible that, you know, brothers of the intended betrothed did not wish him to be in the family. I think even then there was a cult of celebrity.
Poe and Elmira were long-lost lovers. They were high school sweethearts and had just newly found one another. Elmira Shelton's brothers may have been opposed to his engagement to the wealthy widow.
In some ways you might think that people would be happy to have such a well-regarded and famous writer in the family. But again, there were the things about his reputation, that he was a pauper. Those things may have soured it. And so there could have been brothers of his intended betrothed.
And I think that the suggestion is that Elmira Shelton's brothers may have seized upon the opportunity where Poe was traveling away from Richmond, away from their sister, and may have done something to him in Baltimore. I don't know that that holds up to scrutiny, but it's certainly an interesting idea, and it puts a lot of focus on Poe's relationship with Elmira.
But most historians have dismissed this idea as fantasy. Baltimore in the 1840s was known as a mob town, a haven for political corruption and civil discord. Dishonest politicians would enlist the aid of any number of the city's most notorious gangs to help sway elections in their favor. Gangs known as the Rip Raps, the Blood Tubs, and the Plug Uglies would routinely do muscle work for the Whig or Democratic politicians who paid them. These gangs would resort to any number of practices such as ballot stuffing, intimidation, bribery, and even kidnapping. It is believed that during this election time, Poe was a victim of a practice known as cooping.
They would go off into the street and grab someone vulnerable, drag them into a room, coop them there, feed them alcohol and opium until it was time to vote.
It would get you drunk and take you around to different polling places and have you vote multiple times.
Maybe shave them, cut their hair, change their clothes in some way, take them back in so that the ballot judge would kind of look the other way.
Cooping was a unique weapon of political terror, but one that was widely known. The day that Poe was found, a local Baltimore newspaper warned of the practice.
October 3rd. Beware of the Whig tricks. Our opponents are at their old game again. Illegal votes will be polled from a distance and otherwise. Coups have been started by them. All this and more the Whigs are doing. See, Democrats, that they do not succeed. Let us all be on alert.
Edgar Allan Poe was found in a tavern that was also serving as a polling place. He was found on election day, not in his own clothing.
Well, the fact that he was found at a polling place, that he was wearing clothes that didn't seem to be his because they were ill-fitting, that's pretty mysterious by itself right there. We don't know, was he drunk? Was he just perhaps, for whatever reason, in a state that wasn't fully conscious?
The cooping theory pulls together the most prominent pieces of the mystery. It involves alcohol, it involves some kind of violence, Poe's weakened body condition if he had been attacked. All the history really confirms is that he was found in Gunner's Tavern, and the accounts say that he was unconscious at the time.
Leading up to his final hours, in a state of delirium, Poe was heard to be calling the name Reynolds. This added to the mystery until it was discovered that a Judge Henry R. Reynolds had been overseeing the voting in Ryan's Tavern.
This lends credibility to the theory that Poe was indeed inside the polling area at some point. Now, combining with the sickness that seemed to pervade him before he departed for Baltimore, it seems that the Dark Poet was a victim of political scheming.
On October 8th, Poe was laid to rest in a plain coffin, in a simple ceremony that saw the attendance of only a few people. No sermon was held, and only a short benediction was recited. As his body was lowered into the ground, it seemed that the tale of his death would long outlive the man.
Poe's death gives us a mystery that can't be solved, and how perfect is that? And yes, we can speculate, but I don't think it could ever be solved.
Nobody can resist the mystery, especially the inventor of detective and mystery fiction dying in such a mysterious way. That is an enduring urban myth and legend that is going to excite generations.
The last stop of Edgar Allan Poe has long galvanized the intrigue of the public. It seems that the mythos of his creation have blended to create a unique interpretation of his death. And as mysterious as his death is, it has served to elevate the city in which he once called home.
Baltimore loves Poe, and you can't go to any corner of the city where you don't find his presence somewhere. There are no other American cities in the country that revere a writer the way Baltimore identifies with Poe.
Baltimore has long embraced the image of Poe as a long-lost son. From sports teams to local fare, his specter seems to haunt this city. Ironically enough, the man who would despise Poe during his life, Rufus Griswold, would seemingly be haunted by his rival in death. It was reported that on Griswold's deathbed, hanging across the room watching him pass, was a portrait of Edgar Allan Poe.
Well, you know, art does often imitate life, but life can imitate art as well. And Poe's death really did imitate his art in that it presented us with a mystery beyond the ability to be explained.
The mystery endures. It's a very fitting tribute to Poe and people's interest in Poe. And it would be sad if there weren't mysteries still to explore. His presence is still felt in the arts today. And so Poe lives on, and Poe lives here.
While the mystery of Poe's last stop may never truly be understood, we can be assured that the prince of the Gothic tale will live on in infamy.